Hi, my name is Maryanne Perrin. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Nutrition at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, and I'm joined today by Bruna Gutierrez dos Santos. She is a doctoral student in the Department of Nutrition, and her research is on milk bank donors. Today, we're going to talk with you about what is currently known about individuals who sell, share, and donate their milk. In terms of an agenda, we'll go over disclosures, then we'll provide a brief overview of the human milk market and how it's different than markets for other tissues. And then we'll look at what's known about sellers, sharers, and donors of milk. And we'll close by offering some areas for future research. So in terms of disclosures, for the last 4 years, I've served on the board of directors for the Human Milk Banking Association of North America. That was an unpaid position. And Bruna and I have no financial conflicts to disclose. So let's do a quick overview of the human milk market. I like to distinguish between the old school human milk market, which is well represented by this image, which was taken in France in the late 1700s. And at that time, France actually had a bureau of wet nurses that allowed families to connect with women who had surplus milk. This act of wet nursing actually is goes back a lot further than the late 1700s. It's referenced in both the Quran and the Bible. So how about today? What does today's human milk market look like? Well, it's a lot more complicated. Women have choices. So one thing is, if they meet specific screening criteria, they could donate their milk to a milk bank. In this image, we depict the milk banks as nonprofit. It's really just to indicate they're focused on optimizing distribution to vulnerable infants versus optimizing a profit. And today there are about 600 milk banks around the world. Special shout out to Brazil, which is Bruna's home country, which has the largest network of over 200 milk banks in Brazil. Individuals with surplus milk can also connect directly with the families who are seeking milk, kind of like the last image from France. What is different today, though, is that the World Wide Web enables families to connect far beyond their traditional geographic community. And finally, individuals today who have surplus milk have the option of selling this milk to commercial entities that are making products from human milk. And often these entities do pay donors for their milk. And so a couple of things I want to point out about today's human milk market and how it's different than other tissue markets. One big issue is regulation. What is human milk in these markets? Is it a human tissue? Is it a food? There is not consensus globally on this. The UK Association of Milk Banks had a very interesting forum last month to talk about regulation. So that's one thing that is kind of contributing to a very dynamic market, is not having consensus about what it is and how to regulate it. Another factor that makes the human milk market very different than other tissue markets is the way the product is collected. It is not collected in a medical environment, in a clinical environment. It's collected at home by the donor, and it may stay in the donor's control for many months before they choose to either sell, share, or donate it. And so whether individuals with surplus milk are participating in all three of these ways of exchanging milk really remains unknown. There's limited information about that. To give you a visual sense of how complex the human milk market is, I just want to show you some logos of organizations that are working with human milk. So these three are probably pretty familiar to many of you. They are some of the large milk banking networks in North America and the UK and Europe. These two logos are entities that have facilitated the selling of human milk. Usually it's been directly between individuals and not between individuals and corporations. These two logos are some of the first commercial entities that were making products that originated from human milk. And these two are some of the first human milk sharing communities that have used public Facebook pages to facilitate the sharing of human milk. And it really seems that the number of organizations continues to grow. The last two logos that came up are these hybrid models. They're both based in the United States. They are considered healthcare provider facilitated exchanges, where healthcare providers screen the donors, but then milk is not pasteurized. It's just distributed raw. And these are just a few more logos of companies that are dealing with human milk. So over here we have NeoCare, a new company in the UK, and BioMilk right here is a new company that is in my backyard here in North Carolina. This is an organization that actually uses mammary cells in a cell culture to produce human milk. In terms of the size of the human milk market, there's really not a lot of good data. We know in the United States that Habana last year dispensed about 7.5 million ounces of milk. That's about 250,000 liters. But there's really no data on how much milk is going through the commercial channel or through the peer sharing. We also know that in terms of growth of the human milk market, at least when we look at the nonprofit milk banks in North America, they have experienced tremendous growth over the last 20 years. So this graph shows a 15-fold increase in ounces dispensed between 2000 and 2020. And Habana actually did even have a slight increase even during the pandemic. So definitely a growing market. So what I'd like to do now is really turn to the literature and what we know about individuals who sell, share, and donate their milk. I'm going to start by talking about milk sellers. So the current evidence is actually quite limited. So there's no demographic information available on the individuals who sell their milk. There are conflicting findings regarding risky behavior of sellers. So a body of work from Keim et al. Reported that milk that had been purchased on the internet had high rates of gram-negative bacteria. About 75% of the samples had gram-negative bacteria growing in them. And about 10% of the samples had been adulterated with bovine milk. This is in contrast to a study by Bloom, who performed a 5-year audit on donors to Prolacta, which is one of the commercial milk sellers. And they looked at the period before they began compensating donors and the period after. And they found no change in almost all of the risk attributes. Use of drugs, serum screening for potential diseases in donors, bovine adulteration didn't change pre and post compensating donors. And interestingly, Bloom reported that 99.96% of the samples had not been adulterated with bovine milk, which is a pretty big difference from the 10% reported by Keim. Likely one of the differences just how the samples were acquired. The Keim study collected milk anonymously on the internet, and with Prolacta, donors are aware through the website of the type of screening that the company does. And then we know that there's very little overlap with people who share their milk and those who sell their milk. So a survey by Palmquist et al. Of over 600 milk sharers in the United States found that only about 2% of them had also sold their milk. This was in the context of selling to an individual, not necessarily selling commercially. All right, so what do we know about milk sharers? Well, fortunately, we know a lot more because of the wonderful work of several anthropologists. So we'll go over an overview of what we know about milk sharers. First of all, we know that it is not uncommon. Both a regional survey by Keim and a national survey by O'Sullivan reported high levels of awareness about milk sharing. Somewhere between 75% and 95% of mothers were aware of this. And O'Sullivan actually showed a little over 10% of women of young children were participating in sharing milk. Now, all of these studies were US-based, but there's a more recent study out of Turkey by Onat that had a similar finding as O'Sullivan. About 10% of women were sharing their milk with peers in the Turkish study. We also know that women who are sharing their milk often don't discuss this with healthcare providers. This was found by O'Sullivan and also in a qualitative study I did of milk sharers. And so this really just suggests that healthcare providers may be an untapped opportunity for getting information about human milk exchange to women with surplus milk. In terms of characteristics, we have two large surveys studies. One was a national study by Palmquist, the other was a regional study by Reyes Foster, and they agreed that women who shared their milk were mostly white. They were mostly college educated. Palmquist reported they'd mostly given birth at term. The reason this is relevant is knowing this information about the donor, whether it was a term birth or a preterm birth, can provide information about the nutrient content of the milk, because we know that preterm birth tends to produce a higher protein content in the milk. And then Palmquist actually was one of the only studies we found where gender was surveyed. I think because human milk is typically associated with being produced by a female, that question is just not often asked in studies. So Palmquist probed for both sex and gender, and she did find that the majority of sharers identified as female, but there was a very small percentage that did report identifying as male. We also know why sharers are providing their milk. This is from work by Carleen Gribble, as well as a study that I did that found that some of the top reasons for donating or sharing milk were having a full freezer of milk that they didn't need anymore, feeling very strongly about the power of human milk, and then wanting to help and connect with families in their community. Finally, we know a little bit about the breastfeeding and lactation history of milk sharers. First of all, we know that they received stronger support from families and employers and spouses than did people in the survey who were seeking milk. So not the people who had surplus milk, but the people who wanted milk. We also know that milk sharers received very strong clinical support from pediatricians compared to people who were seeking milk. We know that milk sharers tend to be very long breastfeeders. So in Palmquist's survey, the average breastfeeding duration of the most current child was over 17 months. And that was confirmed by a recent report out of Kathleen Rasmussen's lab. This was a milk sharing community in the Washington, D.C. area, also reported over 17 months of breastfeeding. To put this in context, in the United States, only 35% of infants are still being breastfed at 12 months. So these individuals who are breastfeeding to 17 months or longer are truly long breastfeeders. On average, milk sharers provided over 1,000 ounces of milk. So this is about 30 liters. And there's a little bit more overlap between milk sharers and milk bankers than between milk sharers and milk sellers. So in Palmquist's survey of over 600 milk sharers, about 10% of them reported that they had also donated to a milk bank. So I'm going to turn things over to Bruna now, and she is going to fill everybody in on what we know about milk bank donors.
Thank you, Dr. Perrin. All right, so to learn more about human milk bank donors, we conducted a systematic scoping review, which is currently under review. For that, we identified 28 studies that were conducted from 2003 to 2020. The majority of the studies were conducted in Brazil and the US, followed by Spain, India, And then an individual study was conducted in France, Norway, Poland, Italy, Taiwan, Korea, and China. Next, please. So to organize our outcome variables, we created some categories and subcategories. So the first one was clinical characteristics, which were identified in 20 out of the 28 studies. The main subcategory for the clinical characteristics was birth history, and the majority of studies only talked about the number of children that the individuals had. And secondarily, they talked about birth term, that could be preterm or term. Next, we looked at donor demographics that were identified in 19 out of the 28 studies. And the majority of the information was based on age and education. Next. The next category is donor experience and beliefs, which was identified in 16 out of the 28 studies. And some subcategories included in that were reasons and enablers for donation, as well as well, this one was the main category that was identified in multiple studies, but in only a few geographies. Something interesting about this one is that 3 studies that were conducted in the United States looked specifically at bereaved donors, but it was only restricted to these 3 studies in the US. The next one is breastfeeding experiences and lactation experiences as well. They were identified in 8 out of the 28 studies, and they looked at subcategories such as breastfeeding success and problems, as well as clinical support and beliefs about milk. But we believe that this category was underexplored because for each subcategory was only identified in 1 or 2 studies. Next. Next, we have donation patterns that were identified in 7 out of the 28 studies. And the subcategories included donation volume and milk type, which can include colostrum versus mature milk, and term and preterm milk. Next. The next one and last was lifestyle characteristics, and the subcategories for this one were diet, exercise, and drug use. Next, please. Okay, so the key findings of this review, we found that age and education were very different by region. So an example is that in the studies conducted in Brazil and India, the donors were in their early and mid-20s, while in the studies conducted in the US and some countries in Europe and Asia, the donors were mostly in their early 30s. Next. The donors were donating for the first time, the majority of them, and that was pretty frequent among the regions that we found. The donors also gave, the majority of them gave birth term, and as mentioned before, this can have an impact in the milk composition when you compare it to someone that gave birth preterm. There was also a wide range of mean and medians from donation volumes, ranging from as little as 0.3 to 30 liters. So we believe that this could be due the fact that milk banks have different requirements. So for example, in the US, some milk banks require a minimum donation volume of 100 ounces, while in Brazil, there's no minimum donation volume. So that could explain that. We also found some common donation reasons that included altruism, having excess milk, and also avoiding the waste of that milk. And some donation enablers were being encouraged by someone to donate their milk, as well as receiving information about the milk banks from healthcare providers. So the person can actually understand how the milk banks work and how to actually donate their milk there. Okay, so for future questions, based on the gaps that we identified in our systematic scoping review, we believe that obtaining more demographic and clinical information is important. So for example, more gender, race, income, and birth term. And as Dr. Perrin mentioned before, gender is something that it's not explored much in this area. In fact, any of the studies that we looked at collected this information, but it's very important to make sure we have that in, instead of just assuming that all donors identify as females. It's also important to understand the type of support that these individuals are receiving, if they're receiving social support from their family and maybe peers, if they're receiving clinical support from their healthcare providers. It's important to look at that further as well. And why are they having so much milk? Is that could be because they're going back to work and they're now pumping more and having storing more milk and then having the surplus milk. It's also important to understand this path too. How are they getting this surplus milk? Recently, WHO highlighted that there's not a lot of information about the motivations, what motivates donors to actually donate. So this is something important to further study as well. Next.
Did you freeze, Bruna?
Okay. Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So the last one is it's also important to learn if the donors are also what are they doing with their milk? Are they only donating to a milk bank, or are they also sharing with a peer and selling? As Dr. Perrin mentioned before, Palmquist et al. Identified that 10% of the milk sharers were also donating to a milk bank. However, this information was not available in those studies about milk bank donors. So it's also important to collect that information to see if they're exchanging their milk somewhere else. So we believe that these are all important questions that need to be addressed for future donor research.
Thank you very much for listening to our presentation, and we understand there's a Q&A process that will take place via email, so we look forward to connecting with folks and hearing any questions you have. Thank you.